remember the night like a painting, fixed, dim, and unchanging. The dining room was half lit by the amber bulbs that always hummed slightly, as if the house itself were tired of listening. My father sat at the head of the table, his silverware aligned as neatly as his sense of fairness, or what I believed was fairness then. My brother, Daniel, arrived late as usual, the scent of cologne and expensive tires drifting in after him. I was already seated. Mother's chair was empty. We had gathered because Father said it was time to talk about the future. I thought that meant balance, responsibility, maybe even recognition. Instead, he poured himself another glass of wine and said, with the calmness of someone reading a weather report, "We saved everything for your brother." There was no hesitation, no apology. Just the clink of glass against his ring. I looked at Daniel, who had the good sense to lower his eyes. The table felt wider than before. Every grain of the wood seemed to echo that single sentence back at me. I remember smiling, because that's what I'd been taught to do when things hurt. If you've ever felt this way, I'd ask now, to whoever's listening, tell me where you're listening from. I want to know if that silence exists in other homes, the kind that follows after your worth has been measured and found unnecessary. The evening stretched on. Father listed reasons. Daniel had a family to support, the business to manage, the estate to maintain. I apparently had my independence, as though solitude was a fortune I'd inherited without notice. The wine deepened in color. His words did not. I remember noticing how the chandelier trembled faintly, how one bulb flickered, stuttering like it wanted to object but couldn't find the courage. After dinner, Daniel followed me to the porch. The air smelled of wet soil and night jasmine. "It wasn't my idea," he said quietly. "He thinks it's practical. A beautiful word when used for machines, not people." "Then why the envelope?" I asked. He frowned. "What envelope?" The question slipped out before I'd planned it. Because earlier, when I'd passed through Father's study, I'd seen one resting on his desk. My name written in Mother's looping script. Her ink faded but unmistakable. I hadn't dared touch it. "I saw something," I said. "From her." Daniel's face stiffened, his practiced empathy faltering. "Maybe it's best to let old things stay buried," he murmured. I watched him walk away, his silhouette blending into the dark garden path lined with marble angels. They looked less like guardians, and more like witnesses turned to stone. Later that night, I sat in my old room, the one with wallpaper faintly yellowed by time. I could still see the outline where my childhood bookshelf had stood. On the table, I placed a candle, Mother's habit when she wanted to think clearly, and let the flame steady itself. The house was asleep, but its walls weren't. They carried whispers through the vents, small sighs of memory. When the clock reached midnight, I went back to the study. The envelope was still there. Dust had gathered like fine snow. I picked it up carefully, feeling the slight weight inside. A single sheet, maybe two. On the back, a seal of blue wax half cracked by age. I hesitated, hearing Father's slow breathing in the next room, the old radiator ticking like a heartbeat out of sync. Then I broke the seal. Inside were only a few lines, written in my mother's elegant hand. "If he tells you it was for your brother, read the ledger behind the mirror." I froze. Behind the mirror. For a moment, the house seemed to lean closer, listening with me. The air grew heavy, like before a confession. That was the first time I realized that truth doesn't arrive loudly. It whispers through old paper and trembling light. I folded the letter again, slid it into my pocket, and looked up at the mirror hanging across the room. Its surface reflected my face, calm but changed, as though someone else was watching from within. And that was the night the inheritance truly began. Not with a fortune, but with a sentence and an envelope that refused to stay closed. I didn't sleep that night. The letter burned in my pocket like a second heartbeat, each pulse a reminder that my mother's silence had been deliberate, not defeated. When morning came, Father had already left for the law firm and Daniel's car was gone. The house felt hollow, its corridors stripped of belonging. I stood before the mirror she mentioned, tracing its carved wooden frame. Behind it, there was nothing visible, only a faint line where the wall had been painted around it. I didn't try to move it then. Fear wasn't the reason. Patience was Secrets, I realized, don't yield to panic. In the weeks that followed, life resumed its old rhythm, but I moved differently through it, quietly collecting details, gestures, hesitations. Daniel called often, speaking in practiced warmth about business expansions and charity dinners. Father, meanwhile, treated me as a polite inconvenience, a visitor who refused to leave entirely. I played my part, the dutiful listener, but my thoughts lingered behind that mirror. Autumn arrived. The estate grounds grew pale and skeletal, leaves gathered by the old fountain where I used to feed stray cats with Mother. One afternoon, I found the gardener sorting through discarded boxes from the attic. Among them lay a ledger, not the one, but close enough to make my pulse quicken. Old handwriting, dates, financial notes. I flipped through it carefully. Her handwriting appeared only once, near the end. Held in trust, final amendment pending. No signatures, no closure, just another unfinished sentence. That night, Daniel came by unannounced. He'd been drinking, the confident kind of drunk that made his words sound righteous. "You're not still thinking about that envelope, are you?" he asked, dropping onto the sofa. "Father said you're taking this too personally." "I just want to understand," I replied. "If everything was his to decide, why did Mother write at all?" He hesitated, then smirked faintly. "Because she couldn't face that you'd never be satisfied with what you had." The sentence cut, but it also told me something. He knew more. He wasn't defending Father out of loyalty, but out of fear. Fear that I might find what they'd buried. When he left, I walked straight to the study. The air was cold, carrying that faint metallic scent of dust and forgotten years. I gripped the mirror frame, pressed my thumb along its edge, and felt movement, a small shift. It wasn't nailed. It was latched. I lifted gently, and it came free, revealing a shallow cavity behind it. Inside lay another ledger, older than the one from the attic. Bound in cracked leather, initials embossed faintly. E.W., my mother's maiden name. My hands trembled as I opened it. Every page listed transactions, withdrawals, deposits, cross-referenced initials. But the last page held a single note written in that same looping hand. "One truth may ruin what they built, but lies have already ruined you." I closed the ledger slowly. Outside, the first rain of the season began to fall, thin and steady against the windows. Somewhere deep within the house, I thought I heard the old clock stop ticking, as if it too were holding its breath. I knew then that whatever this was, money, power, inheritance, it wasn't about ownership. It was about erasure, about who deserved to exist in the story and who didn't. And as the rain blurred the world beyond the glass, I made a quiet promise. I would not be written out. The night I found the ledger, sleep became a stranger. I spent hours reading under the yellow lamplight, each page revealing careful entries in my mother's handwriting, dates that matched the years Father claimed the estate had begun to struggle, sums that vanished without record. But what struck me most were the initials scrawled in the margins. D.W., my brother's name. Always next to the largest withdrawals. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the house felt heavier. I hid the ledger beneath the loose floorboard in my room, where the wood still bore the faint etching of my childhood initials. Then I waited. Waiting, I realized, was its own form of power. Over breakfast, Father discussed the foundation gala, speaking as if generosity were his inheritance alone. Daniel was there too, confident again, pouring coffee like he owned the ritual. I watched him carefully, listening for slips, for anything that might reveal he knew about the ledger. Nothing came, just polite laughter, hollow and rehearsed. After they left for the city, I began searching through the study more deliberately. Files, contracts, old bank letters, each told fragments of the same lie. Father hadn't saved everything for Daniel. He had moved assets years before, diverting funds from the company my mother co-owned. Her signature, copied with precision, appeared on one page. I ran my finger over the ink. It was too smooth, too even. Forged. By evening, the truth had grown unbearable in its silence. I needed confirmation, something living to verify what the papers only hinted at. I found it unexpectedly in Mrs. Latham, the former accountant who now kept books for the local parish. I called her that night, my voice steady but low. When I mentioned the year of the first transfer, There was a pause long enough to expose everything. "Poor child," she whispered, her voice trembling with memory. "Your mother came to me once. Said she feared he'd sign her out of her own life. She left something, told me it wasn't safe in that house." My throat tightened. "Where is it now?" "She made me promise to give it only if someone asked in her name." "It's a letter." She sealed it herself. We met the next morning in the church garden, dew still clinging to the grass. The letter was wrapped in faded cloth, tied with thin blue ribbon. Her hands shook as she passed it to me. "She said one day you'd need to know who she truly trusted," Mrs. Latham said quietly. I thanked her and walked home through the fog. The path blurred beneath my steps, my breath visible in the cold air. At the gate, I stopped, feeling a tremor of fear, not for what I'd find, but for how much I'd already guessed. Inside my room, I untied the ribbon. The letter began simply, in her familiar slanted script. "If you found this, my love, it means the walls have started to speak again. Your father is not the man he was. I stayed for you, for Daniel, hoping decency would return to him. But money became his faith. I left proof in my ledger, not for revenge, but to protect what's rightfully ours. He will try to convince you otherwise. Don't let him." My chest ached. For years I'd told myself she'd been complicit, that her silence had been consent. But this letter shattered that illusion. She had seen everything, and still chosen grace over confrontation. I folded the paper carefully, feeling its fragility between my fingers. Outside, thunder murmured in the distance, soft and slow. I looked toward the mirror where it had all begun, my reflection barely visible in the darkened glass. For the first time, I saw her there, not as memory, but as witness. And beneath her gaze, I knew what had to come next. The letter didn't feel like revelation. It felt like inheritance of a different kind, one stitched with quiet pain and a mother's unfinished defiance. I spent the next few days in stillness, rereading her words until they stopped being sentences and became resolve. The storm that had rumbled in the distance finally arrived, drenching the gardens, washing the dust from the old stone paths. It was then, in that gray hush, that I decided what I would do. Father's birthday dinner was approaching. Every year, the same polished routine, guests from the firm, neighbors pretending affection, Daniel orchestrating the evening as if gratitude were a performance. I knew he would expect me to stay silent, to maintain the family's illusion of unity. But truth doesn't require permission, it only needs timing. The morning of the dinner, I placed the ledger and my mother's letter inside an old leather portfolio. I had them copied at the notary's office, each page stamped and witnessed. The clerk, an elderly man with kind eyes, read one line aloud under his breath and looked at me differently after that. "You're doing the right thing," he said softly. I didn't answer. Rightness was a word that had lost its warmth in our house long ago. By evening, the dining room glowed again with that same amber light I'd once associated with comfort. Crystal reflected laughter, porcelain clinked, and the air smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old pride. I sat opposite Daniel, the space between us lined with years of things unsaid. Father raised a glass and began to speak, his usual sermon of gratitude and legacy. I waited until the last toast was made before setting the portfolio on the table. "I'd like to add something," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. The room fell quiet, the pause thick enough to carry every unspoken history. I opened the ledger, letting the fragile pages fan out. Mother kept records of everything, every transfer, every signature she never gave. I think it's time we all read what really happened. Daniel's face drained of color. Father's expression didn't falter, but his hand, holding the glass, tightened until the stem trembled. A murmur rippled through the guests. I read aloud one line from Mother's note, her handwriting looping like a final act of courage. "He will try to convince you otherwise. Don't let him." For a moment, no one moved. Then Father rose, slow and deliberate, voice low but shaking. "You misunderstand. Those are private matters. Old. Misinterpreted." "Forgery isn't a misunderstanding," I said quietly. "And neither is theft disguised as loyalty." The silence that followed was different this time, cleaner, almost freeing. I gathered the documents, left them on the table, and walked out before anyone could find words to stop me. Outside, the rain had started again, soft against my coat. The lamps along the driveway flickered through the mist like fading memories. I reached the gate and turned once, seeing the windows of the house glowing faintly. It no longer looked like home, just architecture built from habit and inheritance. In the days that followed, the truth unfolded predictably. Father resigned from the firm within a week. Daniel avoided my calls, though I never expected otherwise. The estate's legal inquiries began quietly, without drama. There was no revenge in it, only restoration. The kind of justice that doesn't shout. I visited Mother's grave one morning, bringing with me a single white envelope. Inside was a copy of her letter and a note of my own. It's done. The silence broke itself. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying that faint scent of jasmine again. I stood there until the sun rose fully, light spilling across the marble like a final absolution. For the first time, I didn't feel forgotten. In the weeks that followed, silence returned. But it was different now. Lighter somehow. No longer something that pressed against my chest. The estate stood unchanged in its structure, yet everything within it felt rearranged, like a painting subtly retouched to reveal its true colors. The lawyers handled what they called the correction of assets, a phrase so bloodless it almost erased the human ache beneath it. Still, I signed where they asked, not for gain but closure. Justice, I had learned, was not about balance. It was about breath. Daniel left for the coast shortly after. His messages came sporadically, polite and brief. I didn't reply. Not out of resentment, but because I understood what distance was doing for both of us. Father, meanwhile, stayed in the house for a time, shrinking into its corners like a shadow outliving its source. When the papers finally cleared, he moved to the smaller cottage near the orchard, the one Mother had loved in her early years. I visited once. He didn't apologize. He simply said, "Your mother would have been proud." I didn't argue. That was his piece to keep and mine to interpret. Spring arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The gardens came alive again, new blooms pressing through the same soil that had buried so much deceit. I found myself restoring small things. A cracked vase from Mother's room, an old photograph of us by the sea. It was strange how memory changed shape once the lies surrounding it were gone. Her smile no longer looked distant, just tired in a way I finally understood. Sometimes, late at night, I would walk the halls and stop before the mirror where everything had begun. Its surface was still faintly smudged with fingerprints. Mine, hers, time's. I didn't move it again. Some secrets are meant to remain revealed only once. What mattered was not what it had hidden, but that I'd learned how to look beyond reflection. One evening, I found the candle she used to keep by her writing desk, half burned but still usable. I lit it and placed it on the windowsill. The flame flickered against the glass, catching the faint shimmer of the rain outside. I realized then that justice hadn't come like a storm. It had come like that small flame, steady and unhurried, illuminating what was always there. I sat by the window for a long time, listening to the rain soften into mist. Somewhere in the orchard, I could hear the faint hum of wind chimes Father had hung years ago, their tones uneven but oddly soothing. I thought about my mother's words, how truth, once spoken, never really ends. It echoes quietly in the spaces it restores. When dawn finally touched the horizon, I felt something unclench inside me. The house, the ledger, even the bitterness. They all seemed smaller now, folded neatly into a story that no longer needed retelling. I closed the window, let the candle burn itself out, and whispered a final line into the waking light. Some inherit gold, others guilt. But I inherited her courage, and that, at last, was enough.